The Telephone, short story by Mary Treadgold, narration by Aya Bovine. If you would catch the spleen and laugh yourselves to stitches, follow me, I called to Sir Toby, and as I ran across the stage, caught the eye of the white-haired man in the VIP's row. The light from the stage streamed out over the darkened theater. He was leaning forward, amused, laughing, and as Sir Toby chased after me, I laughed back. I had fallen in love with him at sight. There, from the middle of the stage, at an end-of-term dramatic school performance of Twelfth Night. We met at the party after the show, and met again and again, and when we began to meet in backstreet Soho restaurants, and then in my tiny London flat, I loved him desperately. I had never been in love before, and Allan had not been in love for over 30 years. Not since he had married Catherine, he told me, in some queer little snowbound Canadian township. I never meant this to happen. I've never felt like this about any woman before. I don't understand myself, he said restlessly. All throughout that winter, I clung to Allan. We kept the long, secret winter afternoons and evenings together. There was so much that he wanted to give me. The things I wanted for myself, more than wanted, believed I must have. I want to give you kindness, and shelter, and love, he said. He and Catherine had no children, but it could not go on like that. Every time he came to my flat, the conflict in him deepened. It was like the deepening rift splitting a tree trunk down to its roots. He would turn wearily towards me. "How can I hurt her?" he would ask me. "Catherine and we've been together all these years, long before you were even born. Why, I knew her when she was a schoolgirl, a child. Look what we've done together. Look at our work." I tried to understand, but I seemed to see only a gray, ghostly marriage, a kind of deadly, intellectual, middle-aged companionship stretching back down the years. There was nothing there, I thought, that should be preserved. It would be so different for us, I thought, and I clung the more desperately. "I cannot live without you," I said, believing that I could not. Our dilemma, Allan's agony, was resolved by Catherine finding out. There was no drama, no scenes. During the next few months, I never knew what passed between them. I dare not ask. I felt like a child whose parents are gravely discussing an extra importance beyond its comprehension. But presently, Catherine went unobtrusively back to Canada without Allan. Allan shut up the house in Hampstead and talked of selling it. Neither of us wanted to live there. Immediately after our marriage, we came up to this cottage in the Western Highlands, which we rented through an advertisement in the Times. That year, Scotland had one of its rare perfect summers. We bathed and fished, and the long halcyon days passed over us with scarcely a break in the weather. I was blissfully happy. Free from the conflicts and indecisions of the past months, we turned again to each other, discovering new releases, a new and deepening absorption. Our cottage lay by the shore in a curve of the hills, and whenever I remember that summer, it seems as if the falling tides of the Atlantic were always in our ears, and as if the white sands were always under our bare feet. But again, it could not last. One scorching day in early September, I came around the cottage at lunchtime, carrying a pot roast over to the table under our rowan tree. I found Allan sitting, staring down at an open airmail letter that the postman had just delivered. He looked up as I put down the pot roast. His face was dazed and his hands were shaking. "Catherine is dead," he said incredulously. "Dead. This letter's from her sister in Toronto. She says," and he stared again at the letter as though they were lying words. "She says, heart failure. Very peacefully, she says." His eyes went past mine into the open sea. Then he got up and went into the house, while I stayed, pleating the gingham cloth between my fingers. Once more I felt like a child who had inadvertently witnessed a parent's distress. Shocked, yes, but horribly embarrassed. Then I followed Allan into the cottage and I put my arms around him. All that day I watched over him in my heart as he moved about the place. But we did not mention Catherine, nor the next day, and although I waited for Allan to speak, her name never passed our lips during the next 3 weeks. 3 weeks later to the day, among other letters forwarded from London by the post office, arrived the telephone bill for Hampstead House, the second demand. We had forgotten about the first. "Damn," said Allan. We were once again eating our lunch in the garden. "Damn, I ought to have had the thing disconnected before we ever left London." I picked up the envelope and looked at the date of forwarding. "They'll probably have to cut you off themselves by now," I said. But Allan was already crossing the grass to collect the pudding from the kitchen oven. "Go in by the hall," I called after him. "You can find out if it's still connected by ringing the number. If you hear it ringing away at the London end, you'll know it's still on." And I lay back in my deck chair, staring up at the scarlet rowan berries against the sky, and thinking that Allan was beginning to hump his shoulders like an old man, and that his skin looked somehow as if the sea salt was drying it out. "Well," I said. "Still connected." Perhaps I invented the slight pause before Allan carefully set down the apple pie and replied, "Yes, still connected." That evening I went up to bed alone because Allan said he wanted to trim the lamps in the kitchen. I was sitting in the window on the light Hielan dusk, brushing my hair and looking out over the sea, when I heard a light tinkle in the hall below. I turned my head, but the house lay silent. I went over to the door. "Hampstead, 96843. Allan's voice, low, strained, came up the stairs. There was a long silence, and then my heart turned over, for I heard his voice again, whispering, "Oh, my dear." But the words broke off, and from the dark well of the hall came a low sob. I suppose I moved, and a floorboard creaked, because I heard the receiver laid down, and I saw Allan's shadow move heavily across the wall at the foot of the stairs. We lay side by side that night, and we never spoke. But I knew it was daybreak before Allan slept. During the next few days, I became terribly afraid. I began to watch over Allan with new eyes, those of a mother. For the first time, I knew a quite different tenderness, one that nearly choked me with its burden of grief and fear for him as he moved above the cottage like a sleepwalker, trying pathetically to keep up appearances before me. His face, as it seemed, aging hourly in its weariness. I became frightened, too, for myself. I kept telling myself that nothing had happened. But in the daytime, I avoided looking at the dead black telephone inert in its old-fashioned stand in the hall. At night, I lay awake, trying not to picture that telephone wire, tautly underground away from our cottage, running steadily south, straight through the border hills, down through England. During that week, I tried never to leave Allan's side. But once I had to go off unexpectedly to the village shop. When I returned, I had to pretend that I hadn't seen him through the half-open door, gently laying down the receiver. And twice more in the evening. There must have been other times. When I was cooking our supper, he slipped out of the kitchen, and I heard that faint solitary tinkle in the hall. I could have rung up the telephone people and begged them to cut off the Hampstead number. But with what excuse? I could have taken pliers and wrenched our own telephone out of its socket. But I knew that nothing would be solved with pliers. But by the weekend, I didn't know what I could try to do for sanity's sake to prevent us from going down into the solitudes of our own guilt. On Friday afternoon, after tea, my opportunity came. It was a glorious evening, golden, with the sand blowing lightly along the shore and a racing tide. I persuaded Allan to go take the boat out for trawl for mackerel on the turn. I watched him go off from the doorway. I waited until I actually saw him push the boat off from our small jetty. Then I turned back into the cottage and closed the door behind me. I had shut out all the evening sunlight so I could hardly see the telephone. But I walked over to it. I took it up in both my hands. I drew a long, deep breath, and I gave the Hampstead number. All that I had been told of Catherine during those bad months in London had been of kindness, and gentleness, and goodness. Nothing of revenge. To this I clung, and upon it I was banking. My teeth were chattering, and I was shaking all over when the bell down in London began to ring. I suppose at that moment I lost my head. I thought I could have sworn I heard the receiver softly raised at the far end, but I suppose I should have waited instead of bursting into words. Now I shall never know, and they were not even the words I had planned. I suppose I reverted, being so frightened, into the kind of prayer one bursts out in childhood. Please, please, I said down in the mouthpiece. Please let me have him now. I know everything I've done's been wrong. It's too late about that. But I won't be a child anymore. I'll look after him like you've always done, I said. Only please, let me have him now. I'll be a wife to him. I promise you, if that's what you're wanting, I can get him right again and I'll take care of him. Now and forevermore. And I banged the receiver down and fled upstairs into our bedroom. Through the window I could see the little boat bobbing about on the sea. I sat down on the window in the full evening sun, and I shook all over, and I cried and cried. In the small hours of the morning came the crisis. I woke. It must have been about 4:30. The bed was empty. In an instant I was wide awake, because down in the hall I could hear the insistent tinkle of the telephone receiver, struck over and over again, and above it, mingled with it, Allan's voice. Somehow I got the lamp lighted. The shadows tilted all over the ceiling, and I could hear the paraffin sloshing around the bowl as I stumbled out to the head of the stairs. Catherine! Catherine! He was shaking the receiver and babbling down the mouthpiece when my light from the staircase fell upon him. He let the receiver drop and stood looking up at me. I can't get her, he said. I wanted her to forgive me, but she doesn't answer. I can't reach her. I brought him up the stairs. I can remember shivering with a little dawn sea wind blowing through my cotton nightdress from the open window. I made him tea, and he sat in the window staring at the grey clouds of the morning. And he said, You must book yourself a room at one of the hotels in Oban. Only for a couple of nights. I'll come back. Probably tomorrow or the next day. You'll see. He began to explain carefully, lightly, as if to a foreigner. You see, I've got to go find Catherine. So I have to go down unexpectedly to London. From our remote part of the Highlands, there are only 2 trains a day. Allan went on the early morning one. I had, of course, no intention of going down to any hotel. I knew where my promise to Catherine lay, where lay my love. I said, yes, yes, to everything Allan said, and stayed in the cottage all that day. And then I caught the evening train. There was no chance of a sleeper. I huddled in the corner of a carriage packed with returning holiday-makers, my face turned first to the twilight, and then to the darkness rushing past the window. In the cold, dead hours, when the other passengers sprawled and snored, the terror for Allan nearly throttled me. Once I dozed off and woke, biting back a scream because I thought I saw the telephone wire running alongside the train, stretching and singing. You'll never know. You'll never know. Euston in the morning loomed gaunt and monstrous. The London streets were dripping with autumn rain. I told the taxi man to drive as fast as possible up to Hampstead. When he pulled up in Allan's road before a gate set in a high wall, I was already half out of the taxi. I pushed the fare at him, slammed open the gate, and ran up the short drive. I had just time to notice that the white Regency house was more or less what I had pictured, before I was up the flight of steps and tugging at the iron bell pull. I was tired. Deadly tired. Deadly afraid. What courage I had ever seemed to have fled. I promise, if you've ever really been here, please have gone, I gabbled, while the London rain poured over me, and the bell reverberated through the house. At last I heard a movement inside the house, and then footsteps slowly drawing towards the door. For a moment, Allan and I stood gazing at each other. Then, suddenly, I was over the threshold and in his arms. While the door swung gently to and fro behind us, I drew him over to the staircase, drew him down, knelt beside him as he sat there on the second stair. He turned his face against my shoulder and heaved a sigh. After a little while, I raised my head and looked about me. We were in a large white-paneled hall, with a window through which I could see a plane tree, its quiet branches stroking the glass. The only thing in common with our hall up in Scotland was the telephone, standing on a mahogany table against the wall. For some moments I gazed at it. My terror was wholly gone, like a dream at morning. But I became aware of a new emotion, disquieting, faintly discreditable. I looked suspiciously down at Allan. I wanted to know. Cautiously I began to frame my question. He was so still, I wondered if he had fallen asleep. But then he stirred, and I took his head between my hands, and as he smiled at me, I turned his face searchingly towards the light. It was calm, as though washed by tidal waters. I knew that I could never ask my question. At that moment, the front door began to peal. We both jumped and got to our feet. "You go," said Allan, disappearing into the back of the house. The sharp-nosed young man in the dripping mackintosh was aggrieved. "Been sent to cut you off," he said. "Bill unpaid, nothing done." I turned back into the hall. About me, above me, the house lay quiet. Only against the window of the boughs of the plane tree clamored in a sudden flurry of wind and rain. The question I could never ask. The answer never to be given. Surely, both were irrelevant. For all the tranquility of the house, I felt my panic begin again to stir. There was only one thing that mattered to me, to us. "Allan," I called, and I try not to let my voice quaver. It's about the telephone. Do you want it cut off? I held my breath. The reply came immediately. Why? Darling, we're going back to Scotland tonight, out of this damnable climate. We don't want to pay for what we aren't gonna need anymore. Tell them they can disconnect it at once.